History as it happens, September 22nd, 2022. What the UN cannot do.
Our world is in big trouble. Divides are growing deeper, inequalities are growing wider, and challenges are spreading farther.
War chosen by one man, to be very blunt. Let us speak plainly. A permanent member of the United Nations Security Council invaded its neighbor, attempted to erase the sovereign state from the map. Russia has shamelessly violated the core tenets of the United Nations Charter.
If words were enough, the United Nations could fulfill its charter to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine is a reminder the UN does not possess magical powers. It has a Security Council made up of nations who guard their own interests, and a mixed record of preventing human misery and promoting global comity. That's next as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Victims blame United Nations peacekeepers for bringing the disease to their nation.
Our actions were not adequate, resulting in unacceptable brutalization of the population.
Any deployment of United States troops inside Rwanda would be for the immediate and the sole purpose of humanitarian relief, not for peacekeeping.
When the UN Charter was formed, the great powers at that time, which included Taiwan, not the People's Republic, they wanted to keep that power to themselves.
You know, during these past 7 months as Ukraine fought off Russia's invasion, I've wondered, where is the UN? What's it doing besides issuing words of condemnation to try to end the war in Eastern Europe? But maybe the better question is, what can the UN do? Because Russia, the aggressor, is on the Security Council, and it can veto any resolution backed by the other world powers. So the answer is really nothing. And the war is making other problems worse, like food insecurity. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres lamented the global climate of mistrust and hostility because everyone can see that right now we need more cooperation.
We have a duty to act, and yet we are gridlocked in colossal global dysfunction. The international community is not ready or willing to tackle the big, dramatic challenges of our age. This crisis threatens the very future of humanity and the fate of our planet.
For his part, President Biden blamed Russia for much of the global discord, saying it violated the UN Charter by invading Ukraine.
Again, just today, President Putin has made overt nuclear threats against Europe and a reckless disregard for the responsibilities of the non-proliferation regime. Now, Russia's calling up more soldiers to join the fight, and the Kremlin is organizing a sham referenda to try to annex parts of Ukraine, an extremely significant violation of the UN Charter.
The war, these speeches, got me thinking of the UN's role in today's world, and historically, the times the UN succeeded, and the many times the UN failed to live up to its principles and made bad situations worse. After the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, UN-led aid workers spread cholera throughout the island. More than 10,000 people died from that outbreak. In several countries, UN peacekeepers have been accused of raping civilians or of failing to protect women from sexual violence, as in 2010 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. UN Special Representative Margaret Wallstrom said hundreds of women were raped, although a UN base was close by.
For them, there is no safe place. They are raped when harvesting crops, when going to the market, when fetching water and firewood, when carrying their babies, when in their homes at night among their loved ones.
And you remember the UN Oil for Food program? An independent investigation found that more than 2,200 companies from 66 countries paid close to $2 billion in kickbacks and illegal surcharges to the government of Saddam Hussein. And that was because UN leadership failed to monitor the program, according to Paul Volcker. He chaired the investigative committee. Here he is speaking in 2005.
But other large and complex challenges, humanitarian, environmental, genocidal, or other, seem sure to appear. They appear alone or they appear in combination. So what's at stake here is whether the United Nations will be able to act effectively, whether it will indeed have the funds, the professional competence, and the administrative leadership to respond.
In 1994, the UN failed to stop the Rwandan genocide. By the time the Security Council voted to supply more than 5,000 troops, it was too late. In an interview on C-SPAN's Washington Journal in 2004, Samantha Power, then a lecturer at Harvard before she became a prominent member of the Obama administration, explained why these situations are so difficult, why intervention isn't as easy as armchair quarterbacks may make it out to be.
There's no question that the UN has been no better, I suppose, than the United States, but I think it is important to point out that the UN doesn't have a bank account or a mind or a mandate or a military of its own. And I think where we really need to look when we judge the UN, as we should, is the UN Security Council, which is its, as it were, its cabinet. It is its executive branch. And it is there that the United States, Russia, Britain, France, China have exerted their will and again and again favored a policy of not only non-intervention but non-involvement. Kofi Annan and the Secretariat have some independent decision-making authority, but the extent to which the UN is actually a building rather than an actor in and of itself, I think is worth stressing. I mean, it's a building where states come together to decide on what they want to do ultimately. And that should change, but it hasn't changed yet.
That may be another way of saying the UN is the countries that make up the UN, that sit in the General Assembly, that rule the Security Council. Karen Mingst has taught international relations all over the world. She is an expert on diplomacy, international organizations, and global governance, a professor emeritus at the University of Kentucky. Karen Mingst, welcome.
Thank you very much.
What attracted you to this subject, and why'd you stick with it for so long?
Well, I'm not sure I stuck with it for so long. It brings together a lot of different issues, peace and security, economic development, which I've been very interested in, as well as certainly more recently dealing with environment and human security, all sorts of humanitarian issues. So it brings together, in a sense, a lot of the issues that really permeate international relations, whether it was in the 20th century or in the 21st century.
And maybe a better question for me to ask is, how has that field of international relations changed over the decades?
Oh, it's changed dramatically. When I first started studying it, it was really a Cold War. And the biggest issues on the agenda were always the Soviet Union versus the United States and the Cold War. And of course, since that time, not only has the Cold War changed, but you've also seen all of these countries who become independent during the 1960s and 1970s, adding new issues of importance to them to the international agenda, entering in new issues that were important to the more developed world, including the environment and including dealing with all sorts of humanitarian problems in a way that, with the changes in media, have made those issues come to the forefront in our everyday life.
That's right. And the UN's portfolio, if you will, has expanded dramatically over the years. We'll get to that in a bit. I think most people today could take an educated guess or take a crack at why the UN was founded after World War II, but I'd still like to briefly go over that history. It was because of what happened during that war. How was it different from the League of Nations, though?
Okay, well, first of all, the League was formed right after World War I. But at that time, the Soviet Union was then in a civil war. China was amidst in chaos. The United States never joined the League, even though its president was a very big supporter of the League. And there was sort of this very idealistic hope that a notion of collective security would work. If all countries agreed that one country was becoming aggressive, that those states would join in against the aggressor. However, what happened, as we all know, is that when Italy became the aggressor or Japan became the aggressor, states had other interests and they did not respond to that aggression. At the same time, the League did undergo institute a number of procedures, processes, which then became embedded in the United Nations. And they also settled territorial disputes. They were the first institution dealing with the refugees issue. So it served as an important forerunner, in a sense, to what later became the United Nations.
Countries were unwilling and maybe incapable of doing something about what happened in Abyssinia with the Italians. I mean, that was a microcosm of the League's problems, where the other powers cut a deal to let Italy get away with its aggression.
Right, because they had other interests. Instead of sort of this ideal perspective that every country would unite against a country that was the aggressor, despite other interests, suggested that no, countries have a variety of interests. And certainly at that time, Italian aggression in Africa, a very unknown part of the world to Western audiences at that time, they were unwilling to try to stop that Italian aggression. So it was really an idealistic experiment, and some of the changes that were instituted when the UN was formed was designed to ameliorate some of those issues.
It is the problem of the nation state, right? Yeah, I'd like to talk about how effective the UN has been at maintaining world peace, promoting global cooperation, especially through the Security Council, because that speaks to what's happening today in Ukraine. So maybe the first test is 1950, North Korea invades South Korea. Is this the only time where a UN military intervention occurred against the direct interests of another Security Council member?
Well, there's a difference between the UN authorizing the Security Council, that is, authorizing action, but not employing its troops from a variety of countries, to cases where the UN authorizes it and mounts its own with countries participating in that action. So, for example, the Korean action, in which they were able to authorize, the Security Council authorized because the Soviet Union was boycott. In 1991, in the Gulf War, was also a case where the Security Council authorized that action. In Afghanistan, in 2001, the UN authorized a response to 9/11. And so there was authorization by the Security Council at that time.
What was the Soviet Union boycotting in 1950? It was unrelated to the war, right?
Yes, that really wasn't important. They were absent. And at that time, this is the beginning, really, of the United Nations. People were unused to the procedures. I think they didn't quite realize what would be
I think you're right about that. They were unaware of all the ramifications of what was going on. You mentioned the Gulf War in 91. Gorbachev gave that coalition his blessing.
Right. It was not a UN blue helmet operation, but a number of countries joined in, participated along with the United States. The United States was certainly the most dominant military power in the Gulf War, but it wasn't the only one. And in Korea as well. I mean, the South Koreans, there were a number of countries that provided troops for the Korean as well as the Gulf War. And so it was a question that the Security Council authorized the action at that point.
These are important examples, but would you say for the most part, the way the Security Council is set up, it prevents the UN from acting as an effective arbiter of major conflicts? Maybe not minor ones.
Okay, it depends on what you mean, because what happened was there were two different major UN provisions. Chapter 6, which was peaceful settlement, that countries should avail themselves of different ways to arbitrate, to bring in third parties in order to settle disputes peacefully. And there was Chapter 7, which is the teeth of the Security Council, which is when there is a threat to peace, that the Security Council votes to take action. And that can either be use of force or it can be provision of sanctions. But what happened was what some people have called Chapter 6.5, which doesn't exist on paper, which became what was known as traditional peacekeeping. And the idea behind, in which most of the UN's actions have been under this traditional peacekeeping. And the theory there was, in disputes where none of the five great powers are directly involved, that the UN gets involved in order to settle disputes, but to prevent the great powers from intervening. Cyprus and Kashmir, some of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, a number of the Middle East operations, these were all traditional peacekeeping. But the idea behind it was, let's not get the great powers involved. So the US in these cases did not send troops. The Soviet Union did not send troops. The Chinese were absent, essentially, in most of it. But the idea was to keep the big powers away. So Chapter 6.5 spawned a whole series of what was called these traditional disputes, which was the intervention of forces, and these were from, quote, neutral parties. In the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, really through the 80s, it was countries like Canada and Sweden and some countries in Latin America who were not directly involved, but who offered their troops to intervene, to put peacekeepers on the line to prevent a war breaking out and having either of the great power, any of the great powers, become involved. That was Chapter 6.5, sort of traditional peacekeeping. And there were a number of operations there that were very successful.
And the UN says it has done 71 international peacekeeping missions in its history. So I know it's easy to blame the UN or criticize the UN, but I suppose we need to understand what its actual mission is. What is the scope of what it's supposed to be doing, right? Before we say, well, they weren't able to stop a war here, when maybe there was really no chance it could.
Well, based upon the great powers did not give them that power.
Yeah.
I mean, when the UN Charter was formed, the great powers at that time, which included Taiwan, not the People's Republic, they wanted to keep that power to themselves.
And that is obviously a problem. That is obviously a problem.
Yes, that's obviously a problem. But what they did was sort of innovate in a way to get around that to a number of these issues which didn't directly involve the great powers. It was where they were on the sidelines. Let's prevent them. The last thing we wanted was U.S. troops going into a lot of these places. Sometimes there were advisors, personnel. You know, as this evolved, this traditional peacekeeping, it became more complex. I mean, the issues became more complex. You have to remember that the UN was set up to say only disputes that are international are under their jurisdiction, not those that are domestic. But this line between domestic and international starts becoming more blurry as civil wars break out. Then technically the UN role, if it was a straight civil war, they were not to be involved because that was a domestic issue. But as we see, as you get into the 50s and 60s or 70s, and especially the 80s, with Bosnia Herzegovina, with the Democratic Republic of the Congo, this line between domestic and international becomes very blurred. And
you mentioned before Taiwan being an initial member of the Security Council. That's because that's where the Nationalist Army escaped to after 1949. I believe Communist China, or the People's Republic, becomes a Security Council member in 1971.
Right.
Should the Security Council, the permanent members, be expanded and maybe Britain and France not be on it anymore? I mean, their empires came to a close a long time ago, and maybe countries like India with more than 1 billion people become permanent members?
Okay, this has been a discussion among members for years. But to do that, to make any of these kinds of charter changes, you have to go through a process. And the charter revision calls for 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly, which would not be a problem getting 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly, but it also requires all of the permanent members of the Security Council. So all of the P5, the big powers, have to agree for those changes. So, of course, there have been all sorts of proposals. Well, we need to include Germany because they're a major economic power. We need to include Japan because they pay a lot of money. Or we need to include India because it has a lot of population. We need to give representation to different parts of the world which are not represented into the P5.
Like Brazil, another huge country, right?
Right, another huge country. But in order to make that, which is a charter, it's equivalent trying to change the U.S. Constitution. It's very difficult to get an amendment through the U.S. Constitution. And yeah, this would require all the P5. So Russia right now pays very little. I mean, because their economic situation has not been very strong, has become weaker. You know, they're not willing to give up that power, that veto that they have. The United States is certainly not willing to give up the veto. U.S. has exercised the veto just as much as, well, and more than a lot of other countries.
I was going to say, you can't expect countries to vote to erode their own influence.
Well, then you're stuck. So when you talked about what the limitations or the United Nations, why haven't they done this? It's not the United Nations, it's the countries, the states who are the members of the United Nations. I think the bureaucracy of the United Nations would just as soon have charter revision in which you have more representation, geographic representation, and representation from countries who are paying a fair share, who have the ability to participate in a stronger way. But that's not the way the charter was written.
Therein lies the answer as to what has the UN done about the war in Ukraine? So what are your thoughts on the UN's role here? Is it doing enough? What can it do? I mean, I do follow the statements coming out of the General Secretary, or is it the Secretary General?
Secretary General.
Yes,
right.
I get that one confused with the former head of the Soviet Union. The title, I mean. Yeah, so what are your views on how the UN has done here? I mean, what can they do?
Well, how they've done versus what can they do? What can they do is the Secretary General can use his good offices, as they call it, one of the provisions under Chapter 6, in other words, to try to convince the sides to go into negotiation and mediation, to get parties to refrain from the conflict. There are people working behind the scenes to try to do this. But clearly, in terms of actually stopping the Russian aggression, no, they can't.
Yeah.
There's no way. You would have to get authorization through the Security Council, and Russia will not give that authorization, and China would not as well.
And even if other countries are part of it, as I suggested before, it doesn't necessarily mean you'd get a better outcome. So no.
Now, what the UN has been doing, I mean, obviously we saw the International Atomic Energy Agency go in with trying to deal with the nuclear reactor in the Ukraine as an expert body. The World Food Program, the UN operated, is operating food relief and security. The refugees are getting help and assistance from the United Nations High Commission on Refugees. So all of the subsidiary organizations, so specialized agencies, are working on a lot of the humanitarian kinds of issues. The economic issues, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, both of which are under the United Nations umbrella, even though it's not direct control. They have given debt relief and changed the amount of debt that Ukraine has. What we hear a lot about is the war crimes, the issue of war crimes. And here what they're really talking about is another instrument that was set up, not directly under the United Nations, which is the International Criminal Court. We've never seen kind of this issue of trying to catalog these war crimes at the same time that the war is occurring. But the hope is that some of those crimes would find their way to adjudication under the International Criminal Court. But the International Criminal Court is not directly part of the UN.
I had a former ICC prosecutor on the show a few weeks ago, actually a few months ago already, and we discussed how difficult it is to bring a war crimes case. What is the UN's credibility like? I said UN. You said before, well, when we talk about the UN, we're really talking about the countries that make up the UN and the Security Council. But what is its credibility like when we consider Rwanda in '94, although that's already about 30 years ago, the Oil for Food program, the cholera outbreak in Haiti, and then in the run-up to the Iraq War, I believe the United States manipulated the UN process with Colin Powell's false presentation, making Iraq out to be an existential threat to civilization.
Let me first go back to your issues of the problems. So there are two separate kinds of issues you're talking about. One, which is the problems that have evolved from some of the peacekeeping operations themselves. these are difficult situations. And, when you talk about the issue of crimes being committed by peacekeepers, a military of third countries who are operating in the name of the United Nations. And that's what has occurred in Haiti, the problem with the cholera, the sexual violence allegations. Those are problems that have stemmed from the peacekeeping operations themselves. And some of those are very, frankly, typical problems that militaries who are in occupation zones have experienced worldwide.
True.
I mean, whether U.S. soldiers in Japan or whether it's some of the countries that were participating in the Rwandan. Those are problems within the peacekeeping operation. With the other part of the problem, your allusion to Powell and the Iraq War, that's different because what was occurring there is the United States, sort of ironically, wanted the UN to authorize the U.S. to go into Iraq. The U.S. pushed this very hard, but they did not. The UN did not. So part of Colin Powell's argument was to try to push the Security Council into authorizing this action. And of course, when the U.S. went into Iraq, it was not UN authorized. Now, after the U.S. went in, then the U.S. asked the Security Council and asked the UN system to try to go in with the IAEA and monitor the weapons and all of these things. So then the U.S. wanted the UN to go in, but we were not successful in getting the Security Council to authorize the invasion of Iraq.
That is correct. The UN did not authorize that invasion. Resolution 1441, though, that some would say that helped pave the way to the war. Do you have any qualms with 1441?
No, I mean, these are evolving situations, and you make a resolution at one point in time and situation changes on the ground. Now, there are other kinds of peace operations that fall in a little bit more under the radar, which the UN has been very involved in. Peace building, for example, in Namibia. We don't hear much about this when Namibia became an independent country, and the UN essentially helped them establish a new country that became Namibia. Cambodia, a peace building operation, the state building operation in Kosovo. And some of that one is still in operation today, and also along with NATO involvement. So these are different iterations the UN has taken to prevent violence or to try to damp down violence. But have they ended violence committed by one of the great powers? No. Any more than the U.S. wanted the UN to be involved in the Vietnam conflict, in the U.S. aggression in Vietnam. That was not on the Security Council agenda. The U.S. would have said that was an appropriate action.
Yeah, the UN doesn't have magical powers. I've been asking you these questions about where it has failed, but we could also try to imagine how much more chaotic the world would be without a United Nations.
Well, and that's exactly why I pointed to these other issues, because, there have been a lot of other breakdowns of peace where the UN has been able to successfully mediate. Kofi Annan, one of the past Secretary Generals, was very successful at certain kinds of mediation.
So, Karen Mingst, why don't we wrap up with the future of the UN and the challenges it will face dealing with climate change and the consequences of climate change, like refugees. Some months ago, I had Alfred McCoy, the historian from the University of Wisconsin, on to discuss his latest book about global governance and how world powers are going to have to, in his view, spend less money on the military in coming decades because they will be forced to spend more resources on dealing with climate change. But he said in order for this to work, the major countries of the world, all the countries of the world, are going to have to cede some of their sovereignty to an international governing body that would have the authority to enforce climate provisions like emissions controls. Will that be the UN, or is that an impossibility given how jealously countries guard their own sovereignty?
I think if you think of when you think of the future, I don't think countries are going to be, quote, giving up any more of the sovereignty than they have already ceded, in a sense, to international bodies. I think where the UN could play a role, and it has been playing this role in climate change, for example, they can help in gathering the data. I mean, you couldn't have ever decided that there was a climate change problem without the UN instruments gathering the necessary longitudinal data. You can set goals, which is what the UN has done, or in the UN special bodies. You can try to set the agenda. You can form partnerships with the non-governmental sectors and with countries around the world. But I do not think you're going to be able to, quote, enforce those provisions, that's going to have to come from domestic players, multinational corporations, realizing that, in fact, there is a problem and that they have something to gain by participating in cutting global emissions, and that they have more to gain than ultimately they have to lose. The UN can play those roles in terms of the data and other organizations, but I don't think we're willing to, at this point, and even when faced with something as complicated, as complex as climate change, when there are a variety of interests, that countries are at different places at different times in terms of their emissions as well as what they can do, that they're willing to cede that authority to an international body.
And the UN has so much to deal with today when it comes to refugees. McCoy's point is, once the worst effects of climate change start to hit parts of the world, you're going to see 10 times as many refugees crossing borders.
The whole issue of the climate refugees. This is one that they're going to have to deal with. But, it's not just the UN. I mean, there's a number of different refugee organizations, and these are outside the UN. And that's the value is that I think we now recognize that the UN is just one player, that there's going to be partnerships, there's going to be relations among other independent international organizations like the International Rescue Committee, for example, very, very active. Civil society, whether it's in the United States or whether it's in Europe or any country around the world. And it's really going to have to be these partnerships of which the UN is a part, but it's certainly not the only one and does not have the power under the present circumstances. And I don't see them achieving that in any short term or even long term. Certainly not in my lifetime, maybe in yours, but I'm not so sure even of that.
We need a climate of global cooperation, and right now there isn't one. I mean, the war in Ukraine is a major aggravation point, if you will.
But we've always had these, as you call them, major aggravation points. And, whether we're sitting now in the United States, the Ukraine is the big issue, but clearly in other parts of the world, there are other major issues, including sort of just the basic economic development issue of food shortages and the food problems in Africa. My other major field of interest where I've spent time is in Africa. And, these are the Ukraine, we didn't think of it as an African issue, but it's become, recognize that it's an African issue because it's a food problem. These problems are interconnected in a way that perhaps we didn't recognize back in the 1940s, and certainly not to the degree that we see it today.
And you have taught all over the world, and your books are used all over the world. That's a great point about how some of the rest of the world views what's going on in Ukraine, not as a battle between autocracy and liberalism, as a source of problems for food and other things like that.
Interconnected in a way that I think we hadn't fully realized when the United Nations was formed. But the major powers are going to, as long as the UN exists, they're going to want to have a greater say than anyone else.
Karen Mingst, we thank you. She is the author of International Organizations, The Politics and Processes of Global Governance, now in its 3rd edition, and The United Nations in the 21st Century, now in its 5th edition. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to keep our focus on the war in Eastern Europe, and we're going to look at it as if it is one of many wars of Soviet succession. We'll be joined by Catholic University historian Michael Kimmage next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.